Hi, this is the week that you get to start working on your rhetorical analysis essay. We will work on this for several weeks. There are a lot of assignments that will build up to your complete draft of this assignment, but because it is an assignment that students do sometimes struggle with, I wanted to give you a little bit of more information and background, some guidelines and things to keep in mind as you approach this assignment. For sure, you need to read Chapter 8 in your arguments textbook to get a really clear understanding of what this assignment is actually asking you to do. And then, of course, make sure that you read the assignment itself, which is in the required papers folder in our course. So let's take a look first at the question of what is rhetorical analysis. Again, Chapter 8 does a great job of reviewing this and giving specific information and examples of what rhetorical analysis is, but I'd just like to talk about it briefly. When you do rhetorical analysis, you are looking at what the argument is that the author is making and how the author is making that argument. Once you've kind of analyzed those methods, how the writer is actually making the argument, you also want to kind of evaluate the effectiveness of the argument based on those methods that you're evaluating. So for example, if you read something that you feel has a really strong appeal to the reader's sense of shared values or expectations, then you would look at specific ways that the author approaches that appeal and then talk about that you feel like with what the author did, they were effective in making their argument. The example that I give here talks about how if you read an article or an essay from an outside source, from one of the assigned texts that you get to choose from for this assignment, you might notice that in one of them, or in the one that you choose, the author uses a lot of anecdotes, and you feel like that's really effective in helping the author to connect with his or her audience. That's an example of a method that an author might use in order to make their argument more effective. Now let's talk briefly about what rhetorical analysis is not. This is sometimes where students, if they are going to struggle with this assignment, this is kind of where I see it happening. Instead of looking at how to analyze specific methods or techniques that the author uses in order to make his or her argument, they instead write their own argument based on the same subject as the author. So let's say that you're reading something about, like in the example here, toxins in the food supply. So rather than saying this is how this particular author makes their argument, they do these certain things in order to help connect with their audience, to persuade their audience that there should not be toxins in our food supply. What they would do instead is the student would say, this is what I think about toxins in the food supply, and this is the argument I would make about it. You'll have an opportunity to do that in another assignment, but that is not what rhetorical analysis is asking you to do. So if you start writing and you're explaining your opinion about the topic that your chosen article is about, then you're not doing rhetorical analysis. Think less about the subject itself and more about how specifically the author is making his or her argument. Now in Chapter 8, they give, I think, a nice possible structure of how you can structure a rhetorical analysis. And so I've kind of replicated that here, but if you want to look in your book, it's on page 169. So you see that there are kind of these four basic elements, and a lot of things happen within each of these elements. But first you have the introduction and the thesis, and then you want to give a brief summary of the source. So think of it as if your reader of your essay is not familiar with the source. You want to give them enough background information and context that they can understand your analysis because they now know what the source itself was about. Then we'll move on to the rhetorical analysis section, and that the circle is bigger here because that is what the bulk of your paper should be focused on, is analyzing those specific methods that the writer uses and exploring their effectiveness, figuring out why they're doing it, how those things help them to connect with their audience, and things of that nature. So that's really the bulk of your paper. If we're talking about a 5 to 6 page paper, probably your introduction and thesis would be 3/4 of a page. I think people could potentially get onto the second page with their introduction and thesis in 1 or 2 paragraphs. Summary of a source, that's about half to 3/4 of a page. The conclusion would be about half a page, and then really the rest of that is going to be the actual work of analysis that you're trying to do. So then we get to the question of what we're actually doing when we do rhetorical analysis. What are the methods that you can analyze? One thing that I would really highly recommend you look at is the chart that is on page 159 and 160. It goes through all different elements of analysis that you can look at and ask specific questions that you can ask of the piece that you're analyzing, which will better enable you to identify and analyze the methods that you'd like to talk about. So I've listed some of the common ones here that we've looked at both in chapter 3 and in chapter 8. We have the idea of ethos, or how the author establishes his or her credibility as an author. How do they connect with their audience in a way that makes the audience trust or believe, or at least be willing to accept what they have to say? Pathos is the idea of connecting with the common values, interests, sometimes the emotion of the reader. How does the author do that, and is it effective in this particular argument that you're analyzing? Logos, of course, is attention to the logic of the argument, both in the types of evidence and examples that the author uses, and also with the kind of internal consistency of the argument. Is it a consistent argument? Does it contradict itself, or does it have kind of a sense of wholeness about it that helps you to be able to accept the argument more effectively? And then this last one that we talked about in chapter 8, this idea of kairos, that's the idea that every argument comes from somewhere. So part of analyzing an argument, figuring out why it would have been effective at the time it was written, where it was written, is being able to understand this idea of kairos. Where did it come from? What was the prompt for this author to write about this in the first place? What's the context of the broader discussion in which it takes place? And then the last thing I will show you, this comes from the University of Colorado Writing Center, and I've included a link in my notes from instructor this week, but they talk about this idea of realm. So when you're doing a rhetorical analysis, you want to make sure that you're including all of the things within realm. So that stands for reader. Okay, so that's the people reading the argument, the essay itself, how it's put together, the author, who the author is, how they establish their credibility, the limitations of the argument, and then the motivation for the argument. Why was the argument written in the first place? Who are they writing to? Who's their target audience? And then, of course, in all of these things, is the argument effective? So I hope that this has helped you to have a better sense of what you're trying to do with rhetorical analysis. But as always, if you have questions, I'm happy to discuss these things and to give you suggestions and insight based on the specific article that you've chosen to analyze. Enjoy!